Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, we're looking at a video from a relatively new channel that I just stumbled across called Thinking to Infinity, which appears to be run by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ himself. The thumbnail for this particular video caught my eye because it's asking if God is evil, a question that I have asked in my thumbnails in the past, and to which I have a pretty solid answer. But the answer that I've usually heard from apologists essentially dodges the question by either being incredulous at the idea of judging God in the first place, how dare you judge the Creator, or it tries to claim that it's impossible to judge God without assuming that God exists, because to judge him means we are assuming a standard of morality, and only God can be that standard. Neither answer addresses the fact that God is depicted in the Bible as behaving in ways that would pretty much universally be seen as evil if someone were to do things like that today. Given the fact that this guy is a Christian, I can guess that his answer to the question will be no, but I'm curious to see how he gets there, or if he even bothers with it at all. This could just be clickbait after all. The title of the video is Can Morality Prove the Existence of God? So this might just be a bog standard moral argument video, but hopefully not. So let's take a look. But first, it's that time of year where I guilt you into supporting my local food bank, because unfortunately for you guys, your past generosity has actually made this recurring fundraiser a really important part of their year. Project Share is not just a food bank, they have several programs that help people in need, everything from helping with bill payments to finding permanent housing to providing temporary housing. They do a lot of good work in Niagara, and they need our help to be able to continue their work. Since starting this fundraiser, we've raised close to $70,000 for Project Share, so let's keep this train rolling. Go to donate.vicerhino.com or click the link in the description to donate now.
Hi everybody, I'm back.
Hi, back. I'm everybody.
When I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of cartoons, and one of my favorites had a regular segment called Good Idea, Bad Idea.
Animaniacs. Good show.
I found prints! No, fingerprints. I don't think so.
Went something like this. Good idea, taking a deep breath before diving into a swimming pool. Bad idea, taking a deep breath after diving into a swimming pool. These were funny because good and bad are so obvious.
Sort of, but it's more about the subversion of expectations rather than just the bad idea being so obviously bad, though that is certainly a part of it. Everyone knows not to breathe underwater, right? But if you just say it's a bad idea to breathe underwater as a normal part of conversation, it probably won't be funny, it'll just be a weird thing for you to have said. But as for the subversion of expectations, in the good idea, bad idea setup, they're playing off of the PSA type of segment that everybody was used to at the time. Breathing clean air is a good idea, so don't pollute it with tobacco. That's bad and will give you cancer. But in a cartoon poking fun at that format, you can have the bad idea move into the realm of absurdity while staying on theme. This also explains why some people find things funny that others do not. Different people will have different expectations, so you can't assume that the same setup and punchline will subvert everyone's expectations in exactly the same way.
Impossible to get wrong. We all agree on what good and bad are, right?
No, we don't. And it's also a bit weird that you're talking about something that is so obviously based on subjective preferences as an example that you seem to be trying to use to get us to the conclusion that morality is not based on subjective preferences. For instance, one of the good idea, bad idea bits was about skiing in the Alps.
Good idea. Going alpine skiing in winter. Bad idea. Going alpine skiing in the summer.
Now, someone who is not familiar with alpine skiing might find that to be amusing because the idea of skiing in the summer is a subversion of expectations. But someone who is familiar with alpine skiing wouldn't see a problem with skiing in the summer, as there are plenty of resorts in the Alps that offer summertime glacier skiing. So in this case, skiing in the Alps in the summer is not obviously a bad idea to everyone, and what's more, we can't use anything other than our own subjective preferences to figure out if it's a good idea or a bad idea. Some people just don't like skiing, so skiing under any circumstances will be seen as a bad idea. Others might enjoy skiing, but know that glacier skiing in the summer isn't always possible, with weather conditions being much less reliable than they are in the winter months, and so even if you like skiing and would like to go glacier skiing, booking an entire trip for something that might get cancelled at the last minute could be a bad idea. but other people might think it's worth the risk. And those people definitely exist, or the resorts that offer glacier skiing just wouldn't, because nobody would buy it. Because skiing in the summer is so obviously a bad idea, right? My point is that the example that he chose as a thing where everyone always knows the good and the bad with no gray areas is actually not that simple, and there are plenty of gray areas.
But when it comes to education, politics, sexuality, we human being people persons regularly disagree on what's good and bad, what's right and wrong.
Hell, some of us even disagree as to whether some of those things should have been included on a list of things that have a moral value assigned to them in the first place. Sexuality, for instance, is not a moral question. But rather than argue the nitty-gritty about this sort of thing, the most practical approach is typically something along the lines of, your right to swing your fist ends at my nose. You are allowed to believe whatever you want about morality, but you may need to rein in some of the actions that result from those beliefs if they start affecting other people.
Take abortion, for example. Yeah, we're jumping right into the deep end of the pool. Some say it's good and right to care for and defend women with unwanted pregnancies, show them compassion and kindness by terminating the pregnancy and giving them their lives back.
That's a very dishonest way to frame this, don't you think? It's not about getting rid of an unwanted pregnancy to give someone their life back, though that can certainly be part of the equation. It's about bodily autonomy. In no other scenario is someone forced to use their body for someone else's gain. If one of my kids needs a kidney transplant and I'm the only viable donor, I am within my rights as a person with autonomy to say no, even if it results in the death of my own child. And nobody is lobbying for the removal of that type of bodily autonomy, even though most people would probably agree that my refusing to donate a kidney in this instance would be immoral. So first and foremost, it's an issue of autonomy. Nobody should be forced into using their body for the sake of someone else, no matter who that someone else is. Second, I am very much of the opinion that every baby deserves to be a wanted baby. I would much rather never have been born than to have been born in a home where I wasn't wanted, where my parents were resentful of my very existence. And yes, adoption is a thing, but there's so many problems with the adoption process that I'm just not comfortable recommending that as an option in this case, even if we ignore the fact that carrying a pregnancy to term causes irreparable damage to your body, and so forcing someone to go through that when it's not necessary is just callous. Because of these two reasons alone, denying abortion access is immoral. But wait, there's more! As it turns out, sometimes pregnancy is not just a 9-month pain in the ass, it can actually be deadly. Did your water break before week 20? You're likely to get an infection which can lead to sepsis and death if untreated, with abortion being a huge part of that treatment. Placental abruption, without treatment, it is likely to lead to a hemorrhagic shock and then death. Abortion is the treatment. Preeclampsia can lead to organ damage leading to death if not treated. Abortion can be a part of the treatment. Partial miscarriage, abortion. Ectopic pregnancy, abortion. And this is not an exhaustive list. On top of all this, when there are restrictions on abortion access, it causes a bunch of downstream negative side effects, including, but not limited to, an increase in the rates of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, widening of the existing disparities in adverse infant health outcomes across parental race, an increase in the gestational age at time of abortion, worsening of socioeconomic outcomes for children in areas including education, future employment, and the probability of becoming a teen parent, increased maternal mortality rates, an exacerbation of OBGYN shortages leading to maternal care deserts, and a lowering of the number of MD residency applicants leading to an overall doctor shortage, resulting in worse care not just in maternity-related fields, but in general overall medical care. So yeah, restricting access to abortion is bad for pretty much everyone for a lot of reasons.
Others say, no, it's good and right to care for and defend innocent unborn human beings. Show them compassion and kindness by not letting them be killed.
And the dishonest framing continues. You're making it sound like abortion is murdering people for the sake of your own convenience. Which, sure, you probably honestly believe that, so maybe your framing isn't dishonest per se, but it is uninformed to say the least. The effect is the same either way, though. You injected your bias into the question. I get that you're not trying to be unbiased here, but if you want to convince people that your position is correct, you should at least start by understanding their position enough to be able to accurately state it. For example, having been anti-abortion in the past myself, I fully understand the perspective that a fertilized egg is a full-blown human being complete with personhood and a soul. And honestly, that's a difficult position to argue against. After all, if that were actually the case, then nearly all of the health effects that I mentioned earlier would wind up being a case of killing babies for what are, in this view, relatively minor benefits. After all, I wouldn't murder my fully born children if it somehow meant more doctors would be working in my area, right? This view sees that as no different. But as the Bible is silent about the moment a soul enters the body, I feel that deferring to the Jewish tradition is warranted here, given that Christianity grew out of Judaism, and of course there are all those Judeo-Christian values we keep hearing about in American political discourse, right? So clearly Christians will respect the Jewish values that their religion is based on, right? So, in atheist circles, it's common to hear that the Bible says that the soul enters the body at the first breath, and that Jewish tradition and interpretation supports this. This is mostly based on Adam coming to life not when God built his body out of dirt, but when he breathed the breath of life into his nostrils. He took his first breath and came alive with a soul. God didn't breathe into the nostrils of the other animals after all, so that makes a certain amount of sense. But the Jewish tradition isn't quite as black and white about it. Depending on which rabbi's writings you're reading, it could be at the time of formation of the embryo, which is 40 days after conception, it could be at the circumcision for a boy or at the naming ceremony for a girl, or it could be as late as age 13 for boys and 12 for girls. There's also the debate about the potential for two different types of souls: the animalistic soul that distinguishes live organisms from dead organic matter, and the godly soul that is responsible for humanity's elevated status. And even when you split the soul in two like that, there are still debates about the particulars. Some believe that the animal soul enters at conception, with the godly soul entering at formation. Others believe the godly soul shows up at either the circumcision and naming, or the bar and bat mitzvahs, with still others believing that both grow slowly, with the animal soul beginning during pregnancy, but clearly not being fully formed as the baby is still reliant on the body of the mother, and the godly soul beginning sometime late in pregnancy, or at the circumcision and naming, and not fully present until the bar or bat mitzvah. Some do believe that the godly soul is right there from conception, but they are in the minority. In most cases in Judaism, a fetus is not the equivalent of a baby who has actually been born, as is made clear in Exodus 21:22, where it says, "When men strive together and hurt a woman with child so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no harm follows, the one who hurt her shall be fined, according as the woman's husband shall lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine." The general rule of thumb in Judaism is that abortion is not allowed except in service to the health of the mother, which includes potential psychological and emotional suffering that pregnancy can result in, not a strict "it's only allowed if she's going to die without it." So, if we are deferring to the Judeo part of Judeo-Christian values, since the Christian part is silent on the matter, abortion for the health of the mother should be acceptable, and in service to that end, abortion care should be freely available and a private decision between the pregnant person and their healthcare provider. As soon as the government puts restrictions on it based on their religious ideas of when the soul enters the body, they inevitably trample on someone else's religious ideas. And in this case, it's a rather duplicitous trampling, as the people most vocal about Judeo-Christian values are, for the most part, not even remotely aware of what the Jewish values regarding abortion are.
What about sexuality? Some say it's good to support all consensual sexual expression. Allow people to love and be loved on their own terms so they'll feel valued and fulfilled.
It's not just about the feeling of being valued and fulfilled, it's about not being the target of bigotry and discrimination. If I kiss my partner in public, I don't have to worry about some random person having a violent reaction towards me because of that. Hell, forget violence, even just seeing dirty looks and hearing the muttered comments of condemnation from strangers would be, at the very least, quite tiring. That's one of the things that contributes to minority stress. There are things that straight presenting couples do all the time without thinking about it, where gay and lesbian presenting couples often have to consider their environment in order to determine whether or not something as simple as holding hands is safe for them to do. And aside from the usual suspects of mental health issues like anxiety, depression, and suicidality, minority stress can also lead to the development of PTSD. So yeah, it's not about making everyone feel validated and fulfilled, it's about not actively traumatizing people just because you have some personal hang-ups about their attractions and/or gender identities.
Others say no, it's good to reserve sexuality for monogamous husband and wife relationships, building secure, loving families and avoiding disease so people will feel valued and fulfilled.
Here's the thing, though. One of those views works for everyone if it is universally applied, while the other one causes trauma, mental health issues, and suicide. And guess what? The one that you said stops the spread of disease is the one that causes the trauma, mental health issues, and suicide. Gay people getting married doesn't take away from your straight marriage. If you don't want a gay marriage, don't have a gay marriage and all that. But also, if you're actually concerned about health, then heterosexuality ain't the way to go either. The only marriage that should be acceptable with that concern is lesbian marriage, as lesbians are far less likely to contract and spread STIs than any other sexual orientation.
Everyone's claiming their point of view is the good one. Their point of view is the right one.
In Sexuality's case, it's really quite easy. If all the marriages are allowed, you can still have your straight monogamous relationship and be happy and fulfilled, but the gay couple that would struggle with depression and anxiety in a society that doesn't accept them can also just live a happy and healthy life. But when you outlaw gay marriage, you are necessarily excluding a huge chunk of the population from having access to such a life, instead condemning them to living a much more difficult life than would be the case if you could just mind your own damn business. Hell, even if they wouldn't be happy and healthy, because, you know, humans gonna human, sometimes relationships just suck regardless of the ratio of penises to vaginas, but that would still be one less thing on their plate, making their lives better overall than if your obsession with controlling other people's sex lives won out.
So how do we really know what's right and wrong? It's not as easy as good idea, bad idea.
Actually, in this case, it literally is. Good idea. Allowing everyone to love whomever they fall in love with, presuming reciprocation and that everyone involved is a consenting adult. Bad idea. Causing 7.6% of the population of the United States, about 25 million people, a bunch of mental health issues resulting in things like PTSD and suicide because you think their preference is icky. There certainly are complicated moral issues that would be hard to break down this way, but this one ain't it.
Most people think of goodness like a sliding scale. On one side, we have the baddest of the bad. Kicking puppies, voting for Hitler, and all the sequels to The Matrix.
Ironic list coming from someone who I feel safe assuming voted for Orange Hitler. That's right, I'm saying mean things about Trump again, so go ahead and write your several-page response to the 3 sentences that I'm spending on the subject. I'll be sure to give each and every one of them a most thorough reading with some serious contemplation to boot. I super duper promise.
On the other side, we have the goodiest of the good. Chocolate milk, free chocolate milk, and unlimited free chalky milk. But hold up, says my buddy Carl. I hate chocolate milk. Carl places it on the other end of the scale, because milk gives Carl the bubble guts.
That's actually not a terrible analogy when you consider what we've been talking about thus far. You are sitting there saying that being LGBTQ is wrong because you like plain old-fashioned white milk. Gotta make heterosexuality the boring choice, obviously, so we can't stay with chocolate milk. But Carl is gay. He likes champagne mimosas, and the idea of being with a woman just gives him the bubble guts. This is just a fact about his life. He can't change it about himself, but you are legislating that he must drink white milk or else he can't drink anything for his whole life, because to you, the idea of someone drinking a champagne mimosa is just gross. It's okay that you don't like champagne mimosas, preferring white milk, and it's okay that Carl likes champagne mimosas and can't drink white milk. But for either of you to force the other one to either drink their drink or go thirsty is bad.
Is morality also subjective?
Yes. Without the existence of subjects to which moral judgments could be applied, morality would cease to exist. Morality is itself dependent upon the existence of subjects in order to exist. Ergo, it is necessarily subjective.
Not so fast. Or quick. Now, let's raise the stakes. Imagine a country. We'll call them the People's Republic of We're Gonna Kill You. They decide to invade another country to take their resources and enslave their people. Free stuff and a free labor force. That's good. But the other country, we'd rather you not extend, says, no, that's bad. It would be good to let us live our lives in peace. If morality is subjective, what determines who is right? What's the tiebreaker here?
To oversimplify, look at the two options and figure out which one will have the biggest increase in net well-being and decrease in net harm. The economic benefit that the first country sees from using slave labor is a rather small benefit when compared to the harm of the institution of slavery, so the invade and enslave country is wrong.
Power, violence, oppression. Might makes right.
Now, you've got our systems mixed up. You see, I am looking at what would be the biggest benefit for the most number of people, but you say that God's rules are the good ones because God said so, regardless of the harm that his rules do to people. Which, even setting any of our earthly moral disagreements aside, Jesus said in Matthew 7:13-14 that more people will go to hell than to heaven, so any system of morality that bases itself on Jesus is obviously not one that will result in the best outcome for the largest number of people. It is instead correct because God says so, and he's the one that has the power to throw you in hell if you disagree, so might makes right.
The strongest gets their way, because there's no standard of right and wrong above opinions.
And using God as a standard doesn't get you away from that. God's opinion is right, anything that disagrees is wrong, and he'll get his way because he's the strongest and will throw dissenters into hell. In order for morality to be truly objective, it cannot be based on God. It would have to be external to God, and God would have to work within its parameters in order to be a perfectly moral being. As soon as you base it on God himself, that removes the objectivity and makes it a matter of God's subjective opinion. I know apologists try to get around this by saying it's not God's opinion, it's God's nature, but that seems rather nonsensical. If it's God's nature, and his nature is controlling him in a way that allows him to potentially have a difference of opinion between himself and his nature, but his nature forces him to side with it over his own opinion, then God's nature is just another way of saying that morality is an external force that God has to submit to.
Subjective morality is survival of the fittest, and most ruthless.
No, it absolutely is not. Survival of the fittest is a biological term related to evolution, which apologists misunderstand all the time, likely on purpose. It's not fittest as in strongest and most able to win in a direct one-on-one fight, it is fittest as in the best fit in an environment. If, for example, you were a member of a species with a social structure that required a certain amount of cooperation in order to work, if you have a moral intuition that stealing is wrong, then you are a better fit with that society than someone who thinks that stealing is a moral imperative. As such, you will be more likely to be allowed to continue existing in that society, find a mate, and reproduce, passing on your non-stealing genes. Again, this is oversimplified to make it easier to understand, but hopefully you get the gist and can come to grips with the fact that fittest does not mean biggest and strongest all the time.
Back to our milk analogy. Carl and I might disagree on milk being good, but what about the statement, milk contains lactose? That statement is objective. It's based on the object itself.
Right, so in this case, slavery is wrong is a subjective judgment that is based on an objective measurement of the amount of harm the institution of slavery causes.
So, if I say milk contains lactose, Carl disagrees, we can't both be right. And because of science, we know milk objectively contains lactose.
Do I bother pointing out that milk doesn't automatically mean cow's milk and could mean other things like goat's milk or almond milk that do not contain lactose? I mean, I guess I just did, so suck it, this is my video, I do what I want.
So it really doesn't matter what I, or Carl, or anyone says, when they say it, or where they say it. Even if the entire world agrees that lactose is just a myth, if Carl drinks that glass, the next thing he'll be doing is praying that big handicap stall in the bathroom isn't occupied because it's bubblegut-mageddon.
Okay, but your analogy isn't really working here because the goodness or badness of the milk is still a subjective affair. If you are someone who is lactose intolerant, then sure, milk that contains lactose will have some bad outcomes, but the people who are not lactose intolerant are still free to enjoy it. What's more, I know plenty of people who are lactose intolerant, but frequently subject themselves to, what was it, bubblegut-mageddon? Sure, whatever. They subject themselves to that because they like whatever dairy product so much that they consider the experience of eating it to be pleasant enough that it counterbalances the experience of the bathroom where the lactose hits the fan. On the flip side, I can eat all the dairy that I want, but I just don't care for milk, so I don't drink it despite not being bothered by the lactose. I think milk is bad, but some lactose-intolerant people think it is good. The presence of lactose is not what makes it good or bad. It is the subjective experience of drinking the milk and whatever goes on in your body during digestion.
Opinions do not change the objective truth.
No, they don't, but as I've already pointed out, the assessment of good and bad in your analogy is not actually based on the objective truth in this case. It still boils down to the subjective opinion of the people drinking the milk.
But is there an objective standard for morality that transcends culture and time and opinions?
Sort of, but not really. When push comes to shove, morality is mostly just based on our subjective opinions. It just so happens that since we are a social species, the selection pressures during our evolution favored people who tended towards empathy. And since our social nature allowed a bunch of us to have a bunch of free time, during which they could engage in philosophical masturbation, we invented metacognition, thinking about thinking, in order to stick the messy, evolving, muddled concept of morality into arbitrary boxes, none of which are actually perfect, because nature doesn't like boxes as it turns out. Except for cats. Cats in nature love boxes. That includes the wild cats, not just house cats. Cats do love them boxes.
To identify objective morality, we're going to need two things. First, a clear standard, not evolving morality.
Okay, I can do that. Maximize well-being, minimize harm. With some caveats, of course, but that's the basic standard.
That's like a football game where everybody's making up their own rules and the goalposts never stop moving. Pretty fun to watch, probably, but guaranteed chaos.
Interesting comparison, as a football game that does have a standard set of clear rules is still a matter of not just subjectivity, but arbitrariness. There is no inherent footballness of the universe that dictates objectively what constitutes a football game. That is something that humans decided on their own. We made up the game and its corresponding rules. Kicking a ball into a net is not an objectively good or bad thing in and of itself, but in the context of a football game, because we decided that points are awarded when that happens and the team with the most points wins, then if you have a goal of winning the football game, then kicking the ball into the net is an objectively good thing for you to do. It's a subjective game with subjective rules, but objective judgments about what events in the game are good and bad. And just to drive the point home a little harder, the Americans in my audience are likely getting a bit peeved off at me for talking about football as having a ball that you kick into a net, because as it turns out, the game known as football is a different game depending on where you are in the world. So again, that's another layer of arbitrariness that does have some objectivity attached to it.
Second, we need a reliable judge who gets the final say on interpreting morality.
I can see why that is something that you would want, but the problem is, it's not practical to expect that, and it's rather irrelevant to boot. If morality exists the way you claim it does, where it's some external force dictating right and wrong, then that will be a thing that exists irrespective of the existence of a reliable judge. A reliable judge would be a way of communicating right and wrong to people who don't have access to whatever external force is dictating morality. It is not itself a prerequisite to that morality's existence. This is just you trying to shoehorn God into the definition of morality. And it doesn't even really work because at the end of the day, this moral judge that you're proposing doesn't communicate what morality is to us, he just punishes people for not following his preferred moral code after they die. Oh, but the Bible is the Word of God, and that's how he communicated his moral code to us. Okay, tell that to the literally thousands of denominations of Christianity that all disagree about various moral things. All of them agree that the Bible is the Word of God, but they disagree about what it means. So no, the judge that you propose doesn't actually communicate morality to us. It is just as arbitrary as if he didn't exist in the first place.
Because clear rules won't do us much good if nobody understands those rules, or if the referee isn't being honest.
So, for instance, if the institutions that claim to represent the objective moral standard are constantly squabbling amongst themselves about what is and isn't moral, and keep being caught in scandals regarding them breaching moral principles that nearly everyone unanimously agrees on?
We human being people persons clearly are not up to that task. Hitler thought genocide and world domination was good.
Kinda like Old Testament God, who constantly commanded the Israelites to commit genocide in his name, and promised Abraham that his offspring would achieve world domination. I mean, I guess he didn't use those exact words, but Genesis 22:17-18 says, "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed," read conquered, "because you have obeyed my voice." That's pretty clearly saying that his offspring will dominate the world. So, yeah, God and Hitler have a similar moral code. No wonder Hitler used Christian language and imagery so heavily in his regime.
But don't just blame him. He only got as far as he did because millions of people agreed with him.
Yep. And using my standard of maximizing well-being and minimizing harm, we can say that Hitler, and those that agree with him, Bible God, are objectively wrong. On the flip side, as I already mentioned, Hitler made extensive use of Christian language and imagery. So while I'm sure that you agree with me that his actions were morally wrong, and you would say that sense of wrongness originates from God, it is a fact of history that he used the same text and same religion as part of his justification as you are for yours.
Throughout history, people all over the world thought slavery was a good idea.
Including the people who wrote the Bible. Leviticus 25:44-46 says, "As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their clans that are with you, who have been born into your land. And they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers the people of Israel you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. Ephesians 6:5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Colossians 3:22, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. 1 Timothy 6:1-2, all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to their welfare of their slaves. Titus 2:9-10 says, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try and please them, not to talk back to them, and not to steal from them, but to show that they can be fully trusted, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God our Savior attractive. 1 Peter 2:18, slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Do you know how many Bible verses there are condemning slavery? 0. There are none of them. It doesn't exist. But there is no shortage of Bible verses telling slaves to be good and obedient in order to make Christianity look good. So if you think the practice of slavery violates God's moral law, then you are disagreeing with the Bible.
Then there's MKUltra, where the CIA kidnapped, drugged, experimented on, and even killed United States citizens. But no charges were ever filed because most of our government agreed it was for the greater good. That's not a conspiracy theory. Congress admitted it.
It's true that no files have been charged, at least not that I can find, but there have been several successful lawsuits, as well as suits that were settled out of court regarding MKUltra. And in the unsuccessful suits, it isn't a case of the CIA did nothing wrong, it's usually more of a we know they were in the wrong, so all you have to do is prove that you were one of their victims and you win sort of things. So, yeah. As a society, we all agree that what the CIA did with MKUltra was wrong, and the fact that it was wrong was acknowledged by President Gerald Ford and the CIA director William Colby when they apologized to the family of one of the people who died as a result of MKUltra. So, while the perpetrators of MKUltra likely did justify it to themselves as being for the greater good, even at the time, what they were doing violated the standard of ethical practice around human experimentation, and they knew this, which is why they destroyed a bunch of their own records.
So, we need a clear standard and a reliable judge who is not just another corrupt human.
But again, the judge that you are proposing does not reliably communicate right and wrong to us until after we die. Otherwise, Christians would all actually agree on morality. So if that actually were a requirement for objective morality to exist, then I'm sorry, but you're shit out of luck. Objective morality does not exist, as such a judge is nowhere to be found. I mean, you can find him in the assertions of Apologist, but for all practical purposes, he's just not here.
Some people point to world religions to explain morality, but can they pass the test?
Not really. But I mean, the way you're saying that makes me think that you don't consider Christianity to be a world religion, which would be a really weird stance to take, but go on.
With Islam, Muslims say right and wrong are determined by their god Allah, who they admit is still capable of doing evil if he wants, but wrong actions become good simply because Allah does them. So morality is a moving target based on Allah's whims. No clear standard, and a judge who is not obligated to be honest with us about it.
I mean, to be fair, that actually sounds like a way more intellectually honest version of the typical description of morality that Christian apologists will give. It's divine command theory. God is the source of good, so whatever God does is automatically good, even if we would consider it evil, because God is the source of good.
Hinduism has a seemingly never-ending supply of gods and philosophies that often disagree with each other, and more than a few of those gods, like Krishna, are known for being deceitful tricksters. No clear standard, judged by deceptive gods and imperfect people.
But much more successful at explaining why the universe is the way it is. Why is there evil? Because gods are not omnipotent and some of them are malicious, that's why.
Buddhism emphasizes compassion, nonviolence, and mindfulness as ultimate good. Buddhism and Taoism have no gods per se, so their morality is determined by imperfect human beings, just like you and me. And just like every single Thailand Buddhist temple monk who tested positive for meth after a drug raid in November of 2022.
We really gonna start using the behavior of religious leaders as an argument against that religion's ability to inform morality? You sure you want to go down that road? I'm not sure what denomination this guy is, but there is a good chance that if he were to Google his denomination's name, followed by the word sex scandal, he will find multiple stories of prominent figures from his religion abusing children, having affairs, visiting prostitutes, or something else along those lines. I get that he's trying to differentiate by having Christianity appeal to the Christian God as the judge, but I also know that Buddhists would disagree about the claim that morality is ultimately judged by people. You don't attain nirvana by popular vote, it's your reward for freeing yourself from desire, and desire is what leads to evil and suffering. So a failure of Buddhist monks avoiding the desire to do meth does not mean that people have failed to determine right and wrong, it means that those monks have failed on their personal journeys to nirvana.
Just like the Dalai Lama himself, who sexually assaulted a young boy in public in April of this year. So, those don't work.
Again, are you sure you want to bring up allegations of sexual assault perpetrated by religious leaders as an argument against those religions? This wouldn't have been hard to avoid. If you wanted an example of Buddhism perpetrating evil, you could have just gone with the genocidal regime in Myanmar, which has been attempting to exterminate the Rohingya Muslim population since 2016. I mean, they've been violently persecuting them at least since the 1970s, but it ramped up quite a bit in 2016.
There's Hollywood religion. No, not that one. You know, the one where good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell.
Oh, you mean a religious system that is actually fair and rewards good actions while punishing bad ones? Also, I find it amusing that you're using What Dreams May Come as an example of the Hollywood religion where good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell. The whole point of that movie is that it wasn't fair that Annie, Robin Williams' character's wife, went to hell simply because she died by suicide, not because she was a bad person. All Dogs Go to Heaven is even worse for your point. The very premise of that movie is that even bad dogs go to heaven. Charlie, the protagonist, is murdered by his co-conspirator at the beginning of the film and finds himself in heaven despite having been an immoral con artist in life. Hell, at the end of the movie, the main bad guy shows up in heaven. He does escape back to Earth to seek revenge on the gator that killed him, but the movie ends with Charlie, back in heaven himself, saying, he'll be back. I don't remember the plots of the rest of those movies well enough to comment, but so far, a third of his examples don't actually follow the system that he says they do.
If there is a hell. Probably not though, right?
Right, no hell. Because eternal torture for a finite crime, no matter how heinous, is immoral. And as a bit of a fan of rehabilitative justice rather than retributive justice, I'd say that punishment just for punishment's sake is itself immoral. If there is no possibility for the person being punished to turn their life around and earn redemption, then the punishment serves no purpose other than to satisfy the urge for retribution of the person that's doing the punishing.
Which is what I think most Westerners believe these days. How good is good enough for heaven on this view, though?
Well, if I had to steelman the position, if you lived your life in such a way that there was a net increase in well-being and decrease in harm as a result of your actions, then you get to go to heaven. If there was a net decrease in well-being and increase in harm, you don't.
Well, less good than you, obviously, because you're the hero of this story. How bad is bad enough to go to hell? Hitler or any character portrayed by Alan Rickman.
How dare you suggest that Dr. Lazarus deserves to go to hell?
By Grabthar's hammer. What a savings.
But really, no. The very concept of hell is itself immoral. Like, should Hitler have gotten away with doing what he did? Ideally, no, but eternal torture without the hope of reprieve? Even for Hitler, that's a bit much. He definitely deserves worse than just escaping into the void, but if we're going for pure retribution here, then I'd say if he suffers equal to the amount of suffering that he inflicted upon others during his lifetime, that would be fair before blinking him out of existence. That would take a few thousand years at least, maybe even millions, but it wouldn't be eternal. But at this point, that's just wishful thinking. Whether we think that's a fair system or not has no bearing on if that's actually the system that exists. At this point, he's just appealing to emotions. We would all love for Hitler to pay for his crimes. Even those of us who prefer rehabilitation probably agree with that one on a visceral level. So he uses that feeling to get us agreeing that yes, Hitler deserves hell. Now, isn't God good and just for taking the burden of judgment away from you so you don't have to make such difficult decisions with the less obvious cases? But I find it weird that I was able to come up with a less obviously flawed and immoral system than the God from whom I supposedly get my moral compass.
But it's just one more unclear standard, judged by some really messed up people.
Your unwillingness to actually understand ideas about morality that don't come from Christianity doesn't actually make them unclear or messed up. It's just you not being willing to put in the work to understand them.
Some folks claim objective morality can exist without appealing to a higher power. Atheists like Sam Harris say we can base morality on human flourishing. Actions that promote the well-being of conscious creatures are objectively good. Actions that harm them are objectively bad.
Well, you're missing some key language in there, but yeah, basically.
That makes sense. Until it doesn't. Notice how Sam is smuggling in the exact concepts we're trying to measure. He's using the same scale. He's just swapping out good and bad for wellness and harm. We're right back where we started.
Okay, why is that a problem? If they mean the same thing, then why does it even matter? It's just using language that is less loaded.
Also, if the goal is the well-being of humans, doesn't that justify killing one healthy person to distribute their organs to 10 people on the donor list?
No, it doesn't. That's some of the key language that you were missing. The net increase of well-being and net decrease of harm. And I don't know if Sam Harris would agree with the way I view it, but I subscribe to a moral system that I call compassionate utilitarianism. Yes, in a pure utilitarian system, you could justify killing a healthy person to harvest their organs for people on a donor list. But there are lots of uncertainties in there that could affect the calculation. The organ could be rejected by the recipient's body. There could be other health problems that won't be solved with an organ transplant. The person could be an immoral person whose continued existence will cause a net increase in harm, with the person who was killed for the transplant being a moral person whose continued existence will cause a net increase in well-being, and a whole host of other potential factors that could mess up the moral math. So this is where the compassionate aspect comes in. If there are factors that are impossible to know, then do not take an action that causes harm directly, hoping that a future good may materialize if all the other factors work out perfectly, because in most cases, that's not how it will work out. I explained this in a bit more detail in my standalone video on morality, so go watch that if you want more information, and also marvel at how much better I've gotten at being on camera. Man, I was bad back then. To be clear, I recognize that I'm still not amazing, but progress has been made.
I mean, more human survival, human flourishing, or killing off the weak and feeble-minded who are just slowing down the human herd. We're not going to colonize Mars dragging all this dead weight around, am I right? Human flourishing.
That's more than a bit disingenuous. I'm sure some people still exist who argue for eugenics, but as far as I'm concerned, well-being is not measured with whatever fucked up metric got you to saying that going to Mars is more important than the experiences of actual human beings that have a disability, many of whom are productive members of society. But even if they weren't, this is once again where the compassion comes into play. I would argue that caring for those who cannot care for themselves is a good and moral thing to do, because they are people who have experiences, so their well-being counts as well-being just as much as anyone else's. Caring about someone's well-being is not contingent upon that person being at a certain level of productivity, and to suggest that it would be is just gross to begin with.
Oh, look how quickly human flourishing turns into eugenics.
Only if you're not starting from a position that considers all people's flourishing to be equally valuable, which I would argue actually goes against utilitarian principles, even without adding the compassionate qualifier.
Which makes you wonder, who gets to decide what qualifies as human flourishing?
Killing people that you see as a drain on society is pretty obviously not human flourishing. Society has enough resources to care for those people, so even if they actually were a drain, it wouldn't justify killing them.
And why prioritize conscious creatures? I mean, some conscious creatures think it would be good if we all die off and leave the Earth in peace. Who's to say they're not right?
I'm somewhat sympathetic to the antinatalist position. Humans as a species seem pretty intent on fucking over our future selves in order to make the line go up now, and it's honestly kind of depressing. But hey, that's actually a biblical position. After all, Ecclesiastes 4:2-3 says, "And I thought the dead who were already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun." It's better to not be born than it is to live and then die. So we would be doing future generations a favor if we just stopped producing future generations, according to the Bible at least.
Rhett McLaughlin is a popular YouTuber who famously deconstructed his Christian faith. When he was asked how he'd now teach his kids about morality without God, he said, "Simple. If you steal, you'll earn a reputation as a thief, and that will make your life worse. So, be a moral person, because that will make your life better." Huh.
That is called enlightened self-interest. It's also not a terrible system. In order to operate in society, society has certain expectations of behavior that must be followed. This is the system that allows many people with antisocial personality disorder to continue working in society. They might not have the same moral intuitions as most of us do, but they recognize that behaving as though they do is the only way for them to remain free in society.
Well, that makes sense. Until it doesn't. Because if atheism is right, Rhett is wrong.
Not really. If atheism is right, then being moral for practical reasons is at least as valid as being moral because you have moral intuitions.
If God doesn't exist, it's best to be a thief who doesn't get caught and doesn't feel bad about it. Then you get the free stuff and keep a good reputation.
Maybe, but the fact of the matter is that thieves get caught frequently enough that you could never guarantee that you wouldn't be one of the ones who gets caught. So from a practical standpoint, it just makes more sense not to be.
And with an atheist worldview, that's just fine.
Except, atheism isn't really a worldview. It's just the answer to one question. Do you believe in a god or gods? If the answer is no, you are an atheist. Now, atheism can certainly inform your worldview. After all, if the God of the Bible doesn't exist, then there's no reason to follow the rules in the Bible that don't actually do anything to increase well-being or decrease harm. So when the Bible says that you should not lie with a man as you would with a woman, I can just go ahead and ignore that, because who the fuck cares what the ancient Hebrews got their knickers in a twist over? That's just not relevant to my life. So because of this, you're less likely to find homophobic atheists. They certainly do exist, they're just way less common than homophobic Christians. The worldview you're describing seems to be one that would start with the assumption that everyone has antisocial personality disorder. Since most people do not, we can dismiss that worldview outright. Turns out, most people have empathy and act kindly towards other people because they want to, without really getting into the philosophical weeds as to why. And really, with all the philosophizing that has happened around morality, it often gets overlooked that most people just base their morality on their emotions. They think about a moral or immoral action, and the emotion that results from thinking about that action determines whether that person will consider it to be moral or immoral, and most people don't think about it farther than that, if they even get that far.
There's no God waiting to judge us. We're all just careening towards the eventual heat death of the entire universe anywho.
Never really understood why apologists keep bringing up the heat death of the universe. Like, yeah, that's a thing that'll happen, but who the fuck cares? It's like they think that if something isn't eternal, then it isn't important. Makes me want to send them back to high school economics class so they can relearn the supply and demand curve, because as it turns out, things for which there is an unlimited supply will not be in high demand and so won't fetch as high a price on the market. Ergo, the more of something there is, the less valuable it is. If I have all of eternity to do whatever I want, then this moment isn't all that important. I don't need to make every minute count because I have an infinite number of minutes to look forward to. But if this life is all you get, then every moment is precious and valuable, so we need to spend every moment carefully, considering if this is really something we want to spend our time on. But if you wind up in jail because you just keep murdering everyone you get mad at, thinking that it doesn't matter because the universe will eventually experience heat death several billion years in the future, then you have just wasted a good chunk of the only time on Earth that you have.
It won't matter one itty tidbit if humanity achieves world peace, or we blow ourselves to smithereens in the next 5 minutes.
Maybe not to the rest of the universe at large, but I'd be willing to bet that most human beings do not want to be blown to smithereens in the next 5 minutes, because they'd rather keep on existing. Why do you not take their opinion about their own existence into account here? Why is it an all or nothing? If the universe will eventually end, then nothing matters sort of thing to you?
Nothing really matters in the long run.
Yeah, but it matters a lot in the short run, by which I mean my entire life, which is, to me personally, the long run.
It's just our selfish, me-first DNA staying alive until it inevitably won't. Like John Steinbeck wrote in The Grapes of Wrath, there ain't no sin and there ain't no virtue. There's just stuff people do. But that doesn't feel right to any of us.
Yeah, well, from people on your side, I keep hearing a lot about how facts don't care about your feelings or whatever, so
We know murder, slavery, rape, child abuse are wrong, no matter when or where they happen.
Well, take that up with your God. He seems to have a bit of a different opinion on most of those things.
But without objective morality, we can't say that. We can't even say Hitler was a bad guy. Just, not how I would have done it.
I really don't understand how you can even think that. Like, even if morality is purely subjective and changes from person to person, people still have visceral reactions to things like that. Sure, you can accuse them of being inconsistent if you want, but to pretend like this is a dichotomy where either Christianity is true or Hitler did nothing wrong is just gross.
But there's one option we haven't looked at yet. With Christianity, goodness isn't subjective. It's based on the character of the eternal, unchanging, morally perfect God.
So it's based on the character of a subject, making it subjective. How is that not subjective? Also, can we really call your God morally perfect when the book that is called the Word of God has all those verses approving of slavery that I read earlier? That wasn't even an exhaustive list. There's more, but the other ones come with more caveats and sub-rules about who can be slaves and for how long and whatnot, and I didn't really feel like getting into the weeds on that. But suffice it to say that your God is a huge fan of slavery.
More good equals more like God. Less like God That's bad. Also called evil.
So, torturing people for not worshipping me is good then, right? Because that's a thing that your God does. And I guess then forgiving people without requiring a blood sacrifice first is bad, because your God would never do that.
Moving away from God in any direction is moving towards evil. Let's try this out. Is adultery more or less like God?
Well, God has never been married, according to Christians at least, but he impregnated a teenager that was betrothed to someone else at the time, so adultery is closer to God than not. This is a fun game, let's keep going.
Well, God is perfectly faithful, so adultery is bad.
I wonder if Joseph would have felt the same way. But this also depends on the definition of faithful here. There are polyamorous couples and couples in open relationships who are all perfectly faithful to each other in the sense that they are open and honest about everything, but Christian prudery would insist that they are being unfaithful, because having someone who is not your spouse touch your private bits is always being unfaithful, even if your spouse is aware of it and approves of it.
Making people pay for the bad things they've done? He is perfectly just, so that's like God.
Except in this case, the bad things they've done didn't worship him, because according to Christianity, Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the worst serial killers in modern history, is enjoying eternal paradise without ever having paid for any of the bad things that he did. If Hitler, the guy that you used as an example of someone who definitely deserves hell, survived long enough to have a deathbed conversion, he would have gone straight to heaven without suffering any penalty for his crimes. How is that perfect justice? It seems to be more about God's subjective opinion. If you're willing to suck his dick, he'll let you off the hook for anything you've done wrong, no matter how heinous. But if you're not, then you get cast into the lake of fire for eternal torture, no matter how good you were in life. In what way is that just?
But offering forgiveness and mercy whenever anyone sincerely asks for it? God is perfectly forgiving and merciful, so objective morality achieved!
Nope. You miss the fact that perfect mercy is incompatible with perfect justice, especially the retributive justice that you seem to be presenting by phrasing it as making people pay for the bad things they've done. If it's a system of people pay for the bad things they've done, unless they are friends with the judge, in which case they get let off the hook, then that is neither perfect justice or perfect mercy.
Christianity, an unchanging standard, the immutable character of an eternal God, judged by a perfect being, God himself.
The clear standard is the subjective opinion of the judge. Not sure how that gets you away from subjective morality, especially given your earlier disdain towards moral systems that can be equated with might makes right. Why is God's opinion the one that matters for moral judgments? Because if you disagree, he throws you into a lake of fire. How is that not might makes right?
But wait, some might say, believers have done horrible things in the name of God. That is true.
Yep, and since you used examples of believers of other religions doing horrible things, not even in the name of their religion, just doing horrible things in general, as proof that their religion doesn't have the moral standard, we now get to dismiss Christianity on the same grounds.
But they don't get to judge if those things were good or bad. God does.
Yeah, but the problem is that he doesn't communicate with us about it. He instead lets us flounder around, figuring it out for ourselves in a way that is indistinguishable from our morality not originating with him, and then according to you, he tosses those who didn't manage to figure it out on their own into a lake of fire for the crime of not having figured it out. From a practical perspective, your moral system operates the same way as any other subjective moral system, with the only difference coming in the form of being told, just wait till you're dead, then you'll see.
He also judges if they were just using his name to justify the bad things they were doing. Guess how that's gonna go.
There's the rub. Nobody can actually know who is actually behaving in accordance with God's nature, because God hasn't shared his nature with us in any verifiable way. So as a non-Christian, I look at all the Christian infighting and I have no way of figuring out who are actually following God's nature and who are just using his name to justify the bad things that they do. I mean, you could say that God wrote morality on our hearts, but then that just brings us back to the problem of subjectivity. My moral sense says that being bigoted against LGBTQ people is morally wrong. You clearly disagree. Which of us is right? Sure, you can justify your bigotry by appealing to a book that says slavery is okay, but then why don't you think slavery is okay? That is very clearly spelled out in the same book, even more clearly than the anti-LGBTQ portions are. Yet you have no trouble saying gay people are icky because Bible, even though that same Bible says slavery is fine. So how is a non-Christian supposed to figure out which of the myriad of mutually exclusive denominations is the correct one? I've never heard a satisfying answer to that question. Actually, come to think of it, I'm not even sure I've heard an attempt at an answer to that question. Everyone just kind of assumes that their denomination is the correct one and thinks that that should be obvious to everyone else as well.
And he's a reliable judge.
I mean, when the standard is his own opinion, how could he possibly not be? I am a reliable judge when it comes to my own opinions. That's how I can tell you for certain that mint is objectively evil, even though that's just my opinion based on my nature. I am a reliable judge of that, after all.
Why? Because God can't lie to us.
Ezekiel 14:9. And if the prophet is deceived and speaks a word, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet. Whoops.
Whoopsie.
His nature is goodness and truth. He's the source of those things. Those are components of his very existence.
Well, then I guess he just doesn't exist, since the Bible says that he at least sometimes lies to us, and that he created evil.
I'll explain. If you have a liquid, and you make it so it's no longer wet, it's not a liquid anymore.
Oh god, no, please don't. You have no idea what kind of can of worms you just opened with that one. Alright, fine. Pedants, go nuts in the comments about how liquids are not wet themselves, but they confer the property of wetness onto other things. Or argue with those people and disagree with them. I don't actually care. Engagement!
If God could do something not good, he wouldn't be God.
To reiterate, the Bible literally says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. That's Isaiah 45:7. The book of Job also explicitly credits God with doing evil things to Job in multiple places. So by the standard that you have set forth for proving that God does not exist, God does not exist. At least, if we're taking the Bible at its word. If you want to go ahead and say that the Bible is giving us an inaccurate picture of God, I would be willing to agree for the sake of argument in order to move the conversation forward, but somehow I doubt that that's your position.
So whenever you've experienced something truly good in your life, that's because you got some God spilled on you.
No, that was something else spilling on me, if you know what I mean.
When we try to define goodness without God, it's like trying to explain the word wet while denying liquids exist.
Fun fact, we are actually incapable of perceiving wetness. Our brains just interpret cold as being wet in certain contexts, but none of our nerves can actually feel wet as a sensation all of its own. That's why sometimes when you get a load of laundry out of the dryer that's still warm, you don't realize until you're folding the clothes and they've cooled off a bit that they're still a bit damp. What I'm saying here is that your brain can be tricked into perceiving wetness where none exists, and vice versa. So an argument could be made against the existence of liquids that does include our sensation of wet as part of the argument. I'm not advocating for such a position, just once again pointing out that things aren't as simple as apologists like them to be, and I think I got a little bit bored, so I just wanted to talk about something interesting.
Any other attempt to anchor goodness falls flat with the simple response, says who?
Says Gay Unicorn Gary, creator of all, who place inside all people the desire to participate in gay orgies. Go to merch.viceround.com to get your Gay Unicorn Gary swag now. Hey, I almost never promote my merch store, but I love Gary so much that I felt the need to promote him a bit, and even though his stuff has been available in my store since he first came up in last week's video, I didn't mention it in the video, and a bunch of people commented asking for stickers and things, so there's stickers and things, and cushions and stuff. Don't buy the hat. I only designed that one for me. Teespring hats are way too expensive. But like, if you really want to spend $50 on a $15 hat, go for it.
You? It's just your opinion against the people who disagree with you.
Well, most people can agree with the increasing well-being metric, and most people who aren't apologists arguing against it don't take it to the point of eugenics like you seem to think we do, which honestly says more about you than it does about me.
Culture? Society? Which one? Ours? Victorian society? The Taliban society? It's just your opinion against theirs again.
Okay, so which Christian culture or society should we use? Southern Baptist? Catholic? Orthodox? Lutheran? Unitarian? United? Pentecostal? Progressive? Anglican? IFB? NIFB? And I could keep going. All y'all disagree on pretty fundamental moral questions all the time, so who gets to say who's right? Yeah, God or whatever, but that's not helpful when he won't speak up until after we're dead, and he's throwing a bunch of us in a lake of fire for choosing the wrong denomination while we were alive.
Our evolutionary programming, nature's social contract, survival of the fittest, man. Darwinism 101. Now it's just your opinion against whoever's strong enough to shut you up.
Nope. We are a social species, and as such, evolved a sense of empathy. I don't advocate for using evolution as a justification for morality, but it certainly does do an adequate job of explaining how morality developed in the first place. It also explains why morality is so different in different societies. Sure, there are a handful of things that most societies will mostly agree on, but the specifics can be wildly different depending on what culture you were raised in, and that sort of variation is exactly what we would expect of anything that resulted from evolution, a process that relies on the existence of variation in order to work in the first place.
You will never get out of this unending moral thumb war until you admit we all know murder, slavery, rape are wrong, objectively.
Except in the Bible, God rewarded a guy who murdered an interracial couple for the crime of being an interracial couple. God allowed the Israelites to rape captive women, forcing them into sex slavery. And the laws about slavery explicitly allow it and tell slaves to be good and obedient for their masters, with not a single verse outright condemning the practice. So we all know those things are wrong, but the God that you claim is the standard of morality disagrees with you about that.
And they are only objectively wrong, not because we say so, not because society or evolution says so, because evolution says the opposite.
Evolution says nothing. It is just a process that happens. Saying that evolution says X would be like saying stellar fusion says that no elements heavier than iron are possible. It just doesn't make any sense to say that.
But because those things are in direct opposition to the character of the good God who made us.
Not according to the book that you think describes his character.
Objective morality is evidence that God exists.
Well, even if I grant that, it can't be the God of the Bible for reasons that you yourself laid out, so thanks for disproving Christianity, I guess.
The Bible says in Romans 2:15 that God has written his law on our hearts, and that our consciences confirm this.
Well, my conscience says that the sex I have with my partner, to whom I am not married, is okay, that gay and trans people should have equal rights, and that the God described in the Bible is evil. So yeah, if the God of the Bible gave me my conscience, then he is an evil God who wants me to see him as such.
That's where we get our inner sense of right and wrong. So when you feel guilt, or you're lying in bed at night thinking of that horrible thing you did 14 years ago, that's not an evolutionary glitch. That's God's programming alerting you that you violated his community guidelines.
Okay, but I have not once felt guilty about that time I sucked a dick while my partner watched, so by this metric, God must be okay with that. Gay Unicorn Gary strikes again!
Throughout the Bible, we're told that people will declare themselves wise and good based on their own definitions. But when they do this, they become fools.
But you just said that God gives us our feelings of right and wrong, so our own definitions will necessarily be based on those feelings that God gave us. Why would we be fools for using the moral sense that God supposedly gave us to define morality?
Like, not being able to identify what a woman is?
Oh, fuck you, you transphobic piece of shit. It's too late in the video to get into the weeds in this throwaway line at this point, but I have compiled a collection of research regarding various issues related to trans people, everything from the fact that they exist, to the fact that gender-affirming care has objectively the best outcomes, to the fact that gender and sex are both spectrums that are related but not identical, to the fact that bathroom bills don't actually protect anyone, and more. See the list at research.vicerhino.com. The first link at the very top is an article by Dr. Stephen Novella, a clinical neurologist, on the science of biological sex, and it is a really good summary of the research, but written with an audience of laypeople in mind, so at the very least, go check that one out.
They will call good evil and evil good. Why? Because they desire those things that are least like God, the things furthest away from him.
That doesn't comport with your earlier statement about God writing morality on all of our hearts.
Sexual sin, selfishness, greed, pride. You can only travel so far away from him before you have to either admit you're in the evil zone, or you stop, you turn around, and defiantly say, no, this is good, and that's bad. God is evil.
I mean, by your own metric that you've laid out in this video, yes. This isn't even me judging him based on my own carnal desires or whatever the fuck. This is using the standard that you have repeatedly proposed. So what do you do when your standard of morality can't even adhere to itself?
A lot of that going on these days.
Oh hey, look at that, it's me! I'm famous! Okay, that's it for this one. He just goes into summary mode for the last 30 seconds or so. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Musical Raichu, who says, "Where do you get that most people will end up in hell? The Bible says God is the savior of all people, that all families on earth will be blessed. Sure, those who oppress and exploit will undergo chastisement of the age in a metaphorical furnace, but how do you know it's most people?" Well, I did go over it a little bit earlier in this video, but again, Matthew 7:13-14, where Jesus says that the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many, and the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few, is pretty clearly talking about the path to heaven being the narrow and hard way that few people will take, and the path to hell being a wide and easy way that most people will take. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to donate.vicerhino.com or click the link in the description to donate to Project Share. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream Osiris every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorship manager, Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the opinions that form the basis of the objective morality that is my channel. If you'd like to somehow count as objective despite being definitionally subjective, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/vicerhino. Or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO box address is in the description. See you next time! Phrasing it as making people pay for the... My problem is not breathing in, it's breathing out. I end up with too much air in my lungs, and it isn't coming out fast enough when I talk. He tosses those who didn't manage to figure out into their own lake of fire for the figure it out on their own, not into their own lake of fire. That would be weird. Everybody gets their own personal lake of fire. It's like a hot tub.